Behind me is the Old North Church near Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, where the first fighting of the American Revolution, the War for American Independence, took place on April 19th, 1775. What I'm going to do in the remaining presentations this week is to walk you through the events between 1763 and 1775 that led to this confrontation. Imagine 1763, the colonists who supported the British in their struggle against the French, are elated that that they've collectively been victorious over the French, and yet by 1775 they were at war with the British. So going from allies to enemies over the course of those years. So that's what I'm going to walk you through. I'm going to do it in three kinds of ways. The first is I'm going to walk you through the main events, what I call the spiral of conflict, and that's going to be my own presentation. But the terms and learning objectives are also going to touch upon the PBS documentary that you're going to watch after that. And then you're going to watch another video that that deals with the Stamp Act crisis in more detail, and also frames the war for American independence, or rather the whole American Revolution, through the lens of Mao Zedong's ideas about People's War. Okay, so let's get started. Let me share the screen with you. There we go. Okay, here are the key terms. And by the end of this presentation, and really all three presentations, you should understand from the presentation the spiral of conflict and the major events that drove that spiral. Next, from the PBS documentary, I'd like you to look at the cultural attitudes of American and English elites toward one another, the Stamp Act crisis as a major step toward revolution. That's really when the colonists began to organize for against the British government. That's really the beginning of it. The impact of the Declaratory Act and the next round of duties, those are indirect taxes on the American colonists. And these new duties are called the Townshend duties. Okay. The forms of resistance to the British government, the emergence of a revolutionary spirit among American commoners, and why the American elite viewed this with disquiet. The Boston Massacre and its significance, the coercive acts called the intolerable acts by the Americans and their significance. And then from the Stamp Act crisis video toward the end, I want you to think about examining the conflict through the lens of Mao Zedong's People's War. Okay. Now, as soon as the conflict with France was over, the colonists were disquieted by the British government's passage of a law that created a proclamation line. So the proclamation of 1763, it created a proclamation line that ran along the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, and basically anything beyond beyond that proclamation line was not open to settlement. So that was a prohibition by the British government, and they were in a position to enforce it, because you can't have clear title to land if you just sort of cross the mountains, go into Ohio or whatever, and just sort of are just a squatter. You have no clear title to the land, or you don't have any title at all, because there's no administrative mechanism whereby you can get it. So this was really distressing to the colonists. They had fought the French and Indian War with the intent of finally gaining control of the Ohio country. And here the British were stopping them from doing it. Well, why did the British do that? Chiefly, it was the administrative cost of doing it. The British government had gone deeply into debt. during what they called the 7 Years War, or what was called in Europe the 7 Years War. And so they didn't want to spend the money to create administrative units for that vast interior. And also, they didn't want to buy any more trouble from the Native Americans. There would be something called Pontiac's Rebellion after the French and Indian War, and the British didn't want any more of that. So to minimize conflict, they prevented the colonists from going over, in moves that would antagonize Native Americans. Well, in order to get to pay for the tremendous debt that the British government had acquired, they did something that had not really been done before. They began to tax the colonists. Up until this time, they had pursued what historians have called a policy of salutary neglect, healthful neglect. And the only taxes that had been imposed upon the colonists were through the Navigation Acts, and they were very steep taxes designed to enforce the Navigation Acts and just work with that lens. I don't want to go into more detail. It's going to get it would get pretty complicated if I did. But the operative point here is this taxation, or any taxation, was of concern to the colonists for political reasons, really reasons of political philosophy. And the idea here was that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I own a house and I pay property taxes on it. And, the property taxes are pretty reasonable each year. But what if, I got taxed at a rate high enough that I couldn't pay the tax and keep my home? I'd have to move out. And so I would lose that. Well, what if they placed a high tax on registration for my car each year? Eventually, taxation could be so high and really so punitive that it would destroy my life. So that's what is meant by the power to tax involves the power to destroy. And political thinkers in the colonies were aware of this, and they made other colonists aware of it as well. But at least the Sugar Act was an indirect tax. And what that means is when goods came into American ports, the merchants who bought those goods paid a tax on it called a customs duty, and then they passed along the cost of those duties when they sold these goods to Americans, and so American colonists. And so ordinary people did pay that tax, but they paid it indirectly by paying the merchant who paid the British government. Okay. Well, in 1765, the British government passed something called the Stamp Act, and it was designed to create revenue by actual stamps, and this act had been this measure had been in place in Great Britain for some time. It brought in a lot of revenue. People didn't have a problem with it, and it was a tax on just about everything involving paper. So when wills were probated in courts, they had the people probating it had to pay a tax on the will when it was filed with the court. Any kind of contract, really legal contract, involved having a stamp placed on it. Playing cards, for crying out loud, had to have a stamp on them, and the British people had no problem with this, but the American colonists certainly did, because this was an example of a direct tax. And the colonists were kind of sort of prepared to deal with the indirect taxation, like the Sugar Act in 1764, which of course was a customs duty on sugar. But the Stamp Act enraged them because it exacerbated this idea of the power to tax involves the power to destroy. And now, because it's a direct tax, it was in your face. It wasn't just something, that was built into whatever you were paying, the merchant for, for their goods. It was a tax that you were paying yourself. So, so that was a problem. And it it created so much resistance among the colonists, and you're going to see this in the documentary, and you're going to see it in the video on the Stamp Act crisis. That it really launches the revolution in terms of ticking off the people so much that by various means they force the Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Just in terms of its operation in the colonies, because it's just they're just buying too much trouble with it. But the following year, they passed an act that basically said, we repealed the Stamp Act, but let me tell you, we have the right to impose that kind of tax, and by implication, and we just might do it again. So what this brings into play is the difference between virtual representation and direct representation. I've got the House of Parliament in the picture upstairs, and the British government took the position that the colonists were represented through Parliament virtually. They said, yes, there were members of Parliament that were elected from various districts in Great Britain, but they legislated on behalf of the entire British Empire. And so they had the interests of the entire empire, including the North American colonies, at heart. So the colonies were virtually represented by dint of being British subjects. Okay? There was a British legislature that was taking care of their interests. Now, the colonists didn't understand this because they were used to direct representation, and this is illustrated by the House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature of Virginia, meeting in the Capitol at Williamsburg. It's of course a restored Capitol building, and they're reenactors. By the way, if you haven't been to Colonial Williamsburg, you should. It's really kind of a cool place. But they were used to direct representation, so that they elected members who went to the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. Now, the bills passed by the House of Burgesses were essentially advisory to the royal governor, but royal governors discovered that it was a lot less problematic to govern if, by and large, they followed the advisory votes, essentially, of the House of Burgesses. And so, de facto, colonists were directly represented, by the Burgesses, so-called. They sent to this House of Burgesses. Now, in 1767, 1768, a new round of indirect taxes were imposed, and they're called the Townshend duties because the guy who came up with the idea for them was Charles Townshend, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is sort of the equivalent of the Secretary of Treasury. And he was back to, we've got to pay, the costs of that war. We've got to pay off the debt. We've got to pay for these, the expanded administrative costs of taking care of both the colonies and the newly acquired Canada. We just need more money. And the colonists didn't object to an indirect tax before. They didn't object to the Sugar Act. They were, they were ticked off about the direct tax. Okay. Well, this brought into play, though, the idea of liberty versus slavery. By now, the colonists were ticked off enough that they objected to indirect taxation as well, because they had no direct representation in Parliament. And what you can see in all of this is this spiral of conflict that forms the title of this. Every time the British do something, the colonists react. The British back down. The colonists are satisfied. Then the British government does something else. The colonists react, but this time more forcefully. The British government backs down. But when the British government, renews its attempts to influence the colonists react, and um, and each side is more angry than each other. And so what you get with these, after these Townsend duties, and these duties are on all kinds of things: glass, paper, lead, sugar, a variety of goods. Um, you have uh, uh, you have this kind of mutual antagonism. The colonists are ticked off about this, but the British are becoming ticked off about this. I mean, we pay taxes, for crying out loud. Why are the colonists objecting to paying taxes? And what's all this talk about, slavery? Because by this time the colonists were talking about, we're being taxed without our consent, and that essentially enslaves us to this incipient British tyranny. And Samuel Johnson, who's this British literary giant, really very, very famous guy, um, you know, he makes the famous statement: "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" So it's like, they're talking about liberty and slavery, like they're getting enslaved and so forth. I mean, that's a hoot, because they're actually enslaving human beings. They're talking about us enslaving people. Well, they're enslaving people, for crying out loud. And so, what he says is he loves all mankind. I'm willing to love all mankind except an American. So that's kind of harsh. And then this is worse: Americans are a race of convicts who ought to be thankful for anything we allow them, short of hanging. Johnson was famous for his pithy quotes, and that's not one that the colonists would have particularly appreciated as an example of his wit. In 1770 occurred the Boston Massacre, and this is something else that the PBS documentary deals with pretty well. And the impact of this is that it suggests an incipient tyranny by the British government. You've got people in the streets; they're protesting, and British soldiers in the area fire upon them and kill a small number of them, including, by the way, Crispus Attucks, who was an African American man. So he was one of the first casualties of this American Revolution. Now, the British soldiers argued that they were justified by the protests. It was really getting out of hand. It was turning violent, and so on. But they had a point, and they were represented during their trials because by John Adams. John Adams, who was one of the revolutionaries. John Adams, who would eventually become president of the United States. He represented them during their trial. Not so much because he thought they were not guilty. Kind of thought it was. Certainly, they could argue that side of the case, but because he was a lawyer, and he believed that everyone deserved to have legal representation and to go through the process of due process, let's call it, because this revolutionary spirit was also an orderly spirit. It was the leaders of it were men of property, and one of the things that they did not want to happen would be this revolutionary resistance to devolve into attacks on property and to become disorderly. And this is one of the reasons why, as people from the streets got involved with this, the elites were not all that happy about it, because it wasn't like, the mob is rising up to support us. It's like, oh God, the mob is rising up to support us, and and they're just going to be a problem. So John Adams and others, had a problem with that. They believed, continued to believe in due process. They continued to believe in law and order. Then in 1773, the British passed a Tea Act. Now, Tea had been part of the Townsend duties, but the Townsend duties had since been rescinded because the colonists were so ticked off with them. In 1773, the British introduced this Tea Act. Now, tea for the British Empire was grown in India by a large firm that did it in India, and actually was sort of a kind of a quasi-governmental governmental unit in that region, and they grew a lot of tea, or rather, the Indians grew a lot of tea for them. And in 1772, 1773, they had a surplus. They had a problem. They had too much tea. And so what the British government did was it imposed a tax on tea, but between the fact that the tea was being sold at such low rates, the duty on tea was also very, very small. And so tea was coming in and it was going to be very inexpensive. And if relations with the British government had been good, the colonists would have been like, this is awesome. We like tea. We're now getting it inexpensively. This is the bomb. But by this time, they were upset with the British government, and they were suspicious of what the British government was doing. And perception is reality. When you listen to political discourse today, a lot of it is not so much directed at the substance of what the political opposition wants to do. It's directed at their real motivations for what it is, what they do. Sure, what they're doing seems legitimate, but the reasons why they're doing it aren't, and their ultimate intent is wicked and bad. And so that was what was going on in 1773, because as this guy is saying notionally, sure, tea is less expensive, but are we being hoodwinked? Isn't this a way of taxing us without representation? Isn't this a way to stick it to us in terms of another effort to defy something that they know is very important to us, proper representation if they're going to tax us? And so the colonists rose up in arms about it. And the most famous type of resistance, though far from the only kind of resistance, was the Boston Tea Party late in 1773. And as probably you all know, the Sons of Liberty. It was kind of like the revolutionary equivalent of the Oath Keepers, and they dressed up as Native Americans, so real active cultural appropriation. They boarded the first ship that came into Boston Harbor, carrying crates of tea to the colonies, and they board, and they famously got a hold of those crates and dumped them into the harbor. Well, that's true, they did, but there's something interesting about how they did it. One of the things was they insisted, we're going to do this in a calibrated fashion. We're not going to trash the ship as a whole. We've got to beef with those crates of tea and those crates of tea only. And to underscore their point, they are said to have brought with them a padlock, because they knew they were going to have to break the padlock on the hold of the ship to get at those crates of tea. So it's like, well, we got to break property, and we're going to restore this property. And then another admonition to everybody, and we're not going to steal any of this tea. It all goes in the harbor. This is a protest. We're not criminals. We're not just taking stuff for the sake of taking stuff. This is a political protest. Well, they're going back to the streets of Boston, and one of their number is kind of like walking as if he's got something with him. And, he gets sort of frisked, and yep, sure enough, he's got tea. And what they do, he's dressed like a Native American too. And they just take most of his garb off of him, and pretty much all of it, and send him, sort of scourge him briefly, and then send him running away through the streets of Boston, into the night. So once again, it is a revolution, yes, but it is an orderly revolution, carried out in term with respect toward property. This elite, they don't want to be taxed because they're worried that their property can be taken away from them. So this is a very orderly revolution that's happening. Well, the British government doesn't care, and in 1774 they passed some bills known collectively as the Coercive Acts. That's the British name for them. And so You have the Boston Port Act that closed the harbor to commerce until the citizens paid for the tea that they had destroyed. Then they had the Administration of Justice Act that allowed the royal governor to transfer cases to courts outside Massachusetts, change of venue, when the governor thought that an impartial trial could not be had within the colony, which is basically most of the time. And then there was the Massachusetts Government Act, which revised the colony's laws to increase the royal governor's powers. And notice that all three of these coercive acts are directed at Boston, which was a hotbed of revolutionary spirit and revolutionary action. And part of the intent was to stick it to Massachusetts and get the people of Massachusetts, particularly those Bostonians, to behave better. But part of it was, hey, you 12 other colonies, you don't want this to happen to you, so you better get in line as well. So so Massachusetts was being the one hurt, but the other 12 colonies, realized that they were being intimidated and they didn't like it. But the coercive acts didn't end there. There were two unrelated but antagonistic measures that were passed at about the same time. The first was a new, more extensive quartering act that required colonists to give food and lodging in their homes to British soldiers. Basically, the British Army had not created enough in the way of barracks for soldiers. There was this custom at the time of having civilians do that for them. And how would you like it to have British soldiers in your house against your will? Not all those British soldiers are nice people anyway, and so yeah, not a good idea. And that really made the colonists angry. And then finally, there was the Quebec Act that attached the area north of the Ohio River to Canada. That is, of course, Ohio and what would become Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, all of that region. It would be given, the whole region got an authoritarian and centralized government, which meant that if the colonists were ever allowed to settle beyond the Appalachian Mountains, most of them were not going to be able, anybody north of the Ohio River, they were not going to be allowed to govern themselves. There was going to be a central government imposed upon them. They didn't like that. And the British sent a military expedition. They sort of beefed up the military forces in the colonies, particularly in Massachusetts, of course, which is where the resistance was from. And in April 1775, this British expeditionary force moved out to go to where they knew that the revolutionaries had created a cache of weapons. Basically, there's just a concentrated number of weapons that were available to the revolutionaries. The British knew about this, and they were going to confiscate them. On the way to Concord, they encountered, the Minutemen, very famously so. And the Minutemen were there in part thanks to the First Continental Congress. So maybe they symbolize something that the First Continental Congress had done by passing a resolution saying that things are getting dicey enough that we need to arm for a possible, maybe even probable, military confrontation. And that, of course, is the beginning of the War for American Independence that we're going to look at next week. Now, in 1816, John Adams wrote a letter in which he sort of talked to a friend, sort of walked him through the revolution, the American Revolution entirely. And in the first paragraph, he says that from 1775 to 1783 was the period of war, but not a revolutionary war, for the revolution was complete in the minds of the people and the union of the colonies, because the colonies had been acting in concert. I just mentioned the First Continental Congress. Even before that, they had created committees of correspondence so they could all, stay in touch and tell each other what was going on in their colony, and hear from what was going on in other colonies, and talk about action they could take together. Now, and when you talk about the American Revolution, you usually talk in terms of the colonists, as if all of the colonists are in on revolution. That's not the case, though, and you need to bear that in mind. Okay, uh, colonists is a term of convenience, which what we really need to be thinking of in terms of the revolutionaries, or what we then call the Whigs, for reasons we might get into next week. What we think, based on research nowadays, is we think that only about 40 to 45% of the white population in the 13 colonies supported the patriots, the revolutionary cause. Between 15 and 20% supported the loyalists. And then the remainder, which if goes from a minimum of 35% to 45%, were neutral or passive. It's just like this thing was going on. They didn't want to do it. They wanted to focus on their families, their farming, and other concerns. They weren't interested in the politics, and so the war kind of flowed around them. And the real objective of the war for American independence was not the military defeat of one side or of the other, because both eventually realized it was unlikely that the one can destroy the other, but rather gaining or regaining the allegiance of those who were neutral or passive. Okay, I hope I've set up the revolutionary crisis, these Anglo-American tensions, well enough. Now watch the PBS documentary, followed by that video about the Stamp Act crisis. Okay. Take care.